Welcome into the Why You're On Fantasy Forecast. We're still in our divisional breakdowns right now, focusing on the NFC West. We did the fast one at you guys today. We are still in my photography studio just because there's some equipment in the way of our traditional spot. We've also switched sides on you guys, so if this is a giant curveball...
I kind of like this side, honestly.
Do you?
Yeah, I think we should keep these sides from now on.
Sounds good. Well, if you guys like the setup, let us know down below. But it's been a while since I've been able to do a show with you, Bryan. You've been real busy with work.
Work has been stressful and busy, but, I'm happy because football's starting soon, and I'm really starting to get excited about who I'm going to draft for fantasy this year.
Dude, I am too, and I'm sure you've been keeping track of all the news the past week and a half, but there's been a lot of fantasy relevant news that some people might not be aware of and might be drafting players not knowing this news.
There's been a lot of updates actually since, and I'm sure you know more than me, but let's break it down.
So I'm thinking, before we actually get into it, there actually have been some players that we couldn't discuss because you weren't on the episodes earlier. Sure. So I'm thinking we'll pick those guys to talk about the few weeks before when we're doing more of our mock draft episodes. And we can discuss a player each episode instead of being just stuck on all these guys who we've talked about.
I like that.
So the big news today, broke this morning, Aaron Rodgers has returned to the Packers. Basically, they restructured their contracts so that he has one last run with Green Bay and then he's allowed to leave next year. So this breathes in one more year of elite production from Davante Adams and Aaron Jones. And the biggest loser right now is poor Blake Bortles.
Blake Bortles, I don't think Blake Bortles is ever even going to get the starting job whatsoever. But I think that Aaron Rodgers coming back now, it almost worries me that people are going to draft Davante Adams and Aaron Rodgers in the same spot where they already should have been. However, is he going to try even harder this year to up his value for the next year, or is he just going to completely tank because he's petty and hates the organization?
That's the thing.
I don't know. So that's my biggest concern.
Does he tank his value so he can get traded to the team he wants to go to halfway through the year?
That's another thing too. That could happen, but I don't think he's going to leave Davante Adams after that Instagram post of Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen as like their last dance. So I think Rodgers will probably stay for the year. He'll do what he needs to do. He's not going to be happy whatsoever every game. He'll lose games if he needs to. But I think the stats-wise, I think Davante Adams and Rodgers will probably be in the same area as they were last year, but they'll regress clearly because he's not going to be an MVP again.
Right. I think my idea is that Davante Adams is also going to try to restructure his contract so he can go wherever Rodgers goes next year.
Yeah, I think so too. I've also heard that Davante Adams might go to the Raiders next year, but that's just rumors.
I just feel like he'd be so miserable on the Raiders going from Aaron Rodgers to Derek Carr.
Maybe if they just drop Derek Carr and they bring in Rodgers and Davante Adams and the Las Vegas Raiders build this huge franchise in Las Vegas and, then Rodgers wins the Super Bowl for them, wins it for the new franchise over there. It'd be a pretty good setting there.
So I think one of the biggest things was Aaron Rodgers kind of looked at the NFL landscape and realized what teams are give him the best chance to really win a Super Bowl this year. And the only teams that really need a quarterback that would be the best for them to step into would be the Broncos, and then second on the list would be the Packers. So it's just there weren't many destinations for him to go to where he could really just hold out this entire year and really force himself out.
I agree with that.
Other news is, so I talked on the last episode about how Michael Thomas had just had surgery, will now be missing 4 months, which really doesn't put his return until mid-October at best. So the Saints literally just went to the worst receiving core in the NFL. They recently signed Chris Hogan, former Super Bowl champion, who is currently playing professional lacrosse for the Boston Cannons. Chris Hogan is now their best receiver, but their team is just kind of falling apart before the season starts.
So I'm on TikTok a lot, and I'm on Instagram Explore page, and since we do this fantasy football podcast, the fantasy footballers just keep coming in with videos, and it's just different people who talk about fantasy football, and what I'm hearing as the biggest sleeper this year is Adam Trotman, the tight end for the Saints.
I can't wait.
And I keep hearing it year after year, and I'm starting to think he's my Blake Jarwin from last season, and he's going to be the Adam Trotman now for this season.
Yeah.
And it really depends if Taysom Hill is actually the quarterback or it's going to be Winston. I hope it's Winston because Michael Thomas, when he does come back, will be pretty good. Kamara probably will be better. But if Taysom Hill is the quarterback, that makes Kamara worse. That makes Michael Thomas worse. That makes Trotman worse, clearly. But for Taysom Hill's value, it clearly goes up a little bit because he's a dual threat quarterback.
Right, so the Trout, as we can now call him now that because
I like that.
He was been my He's my super sleeper, like basically very back end of draft.
Well, you know is I know too. So.
Yeah, exactly. So it's basically, for those of you who are new to the name Adam Trautman, he is the current starting tight end for the New Orleans Saints. He was drafted high in the draft last year. He was graded as the best run-blocking tight end in football last year. The two guys in front of him, Jared Cook and Josh Hill, no longer are on the team. And if you're the best blocking tight end, it means you're going to be on the field 100% of the game. And now that Mike Thomas is injured, he could easily be one of the number one targets on this offense.
Probably a good plug and play for at least the first 5 weeks. If not, could sneak into like that 9-10 tight end spot for the end of the year. I think he's going to have a good season, honestly.
He is, too.
I'm hoping for it. I'll draft him at the end of the draft if no one takes him.
Now I'm going to have to remember where you are in the draft, because my situation is if I don't get that tight end that I want, he's my
he's my guy
last
too
pick.
there. If I don't get the TJ Hawkinson, Waller, Kittle, Kelsey, like he's the guy I want at the end of the draft just in case.
We're just going to have such a frustrating draft next to each other.
I'm just hoping I get the pick before you. That's all I care about.
That means I'm going to take you guys on the way back.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
Double-edged sword.
I guess so.
So in other news, the NFL will actually force teams to forfeit games if a COVID outbreak happens amongst unvaccinated players. I think the big thing to take away from this is I think it's very important this year to not overdraft players from one team. In theory, if you get a Mahomes, Kelsey, Clyde, or you can get a Dak, Zeke, Cooper, or Lamb, like that's great for fantasy, but if one of those teams has to forfeit a game, then you're missing out on 4 of your top 5 picks production at least.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I mean, COVID had a pretty big impact in last year's fantasy season, but with this new rule and how serious they're taking COVID this year, it'll be interesting to see how many teams actually have to forfeit, or are they just kind of pressing it to be like, get vaccinated so you guys don't have to forfeit.
Right. Another thing that's finally resurfaced, Bryan, is Deshaun Watson news. It's been silent for the past few months just because of how sensitive it is, but he's back in the news again because he's attending training camp to avoid the $50,000 per day fine, which is just
ridiculous.
Imagine just having enough money to just throw.
Well, $50,000 is nothing to him, but
exactly.
Apparently, it is enough for him to show up to camp, though.
Because basically, if he misses the entire camp of preseason, that's $3 million in total.
Okay, that's a lot for Deshaun Watson.
Yeah.
I mean, he will. The thing is, it's funny because they broke the news that he was back at camp, and then I got another update probably an hour later that there was still allegations out for Deshaun Watson.
10 criminal filings of assault.
And people are saying that, why would we give up 3 first-round picks for a guy who still, has all these court hearings and is still under investigation for all these allegations? It's like, I think 3 first-round picks and more is a lot to ask for a guy that you don't even know who's going to be on your team, rather alone be in the NFL in the next year.
Exactly. So he still wants to be traded, and as of now, the Texans have actually started listening to trade offers because I think they realize that. So they're trying to get what they can for him before it's way too late.
I think they're starting up here and hoping for the best, and then they're going to keep working their way down and be like, just take him at this point.
Exactly. Super small detail that really doesn't matter. The Texans are trading Randall Cobb to the Packers.
Oh, nice. Randall Cobb was real good. Wait, he's going back to the Packers?
Back to the Packers.
Wow, okay.
To reunite with Aaron Rodgers for his last dance.
I'm sure he's super pumped about that. Yeah. He's like, I get an elite receiver now, and Randall Cobb was great about 6 years ago.
Exactly. So now to get into our divisional breakdown, these are going to be deep dives. We're looking at the 4 teams in the NFC West. That's your Seattle Seahawks, Los Angeles Rams, Arizona Cardinals, and San Francisco 49ers. So what we're going to be doing is looking at each player and each team that's going to be fantasy relevant, kind of looking at how they did last year, going to be talking about if we want them on our team or not. So we're going to start off with the team that finished first in the division last year, the Seattle Seahawks, 12-4. We had the tragic wild card loss to the Rams. At quarterback, we have Russell Wilson. Our running back room is Chris Carson and Rashad Penny. Wide receivers, DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, and we have a new rookie named Dwayne Eskridge. Tight ends, Gerald Everett and Will Dissly. Last year, the Seahawks had the 17th ranked offense and 22nd ranked defense in 2020. Pretty pass heavy with the 60-40 run pass split. They have the 12th hardest schedule going into 2021. Also, new offensive coordinator, Shane Waldron. Tight end coach of the Rams. He's coming over to create a more balanced offense.
Not just run the ball all the time.
No.
And then wait till the fourth quarter to play.
No, I think that's what we're going back to because Pete Carroll did not like how much we threw the ball last year. And we had an offensive coordinator that was known for running the ball. And Pete Carroll decided to have him leave because Pete Carroll didn't like how much the run-heavy offensive coordinator was passing the ball.
Okay, well, maybe this will shine a little bit of light on Chris Carson this season, too.
That's what I'm thinking. So we're going to start off with quarterback Russell Wilson. Finished as the quarterback 6 in 2020. 4,212 passing yards to 40 touchdowns, 13 picks, 513 rushing yards, and 2 touchdowns. I see him as always Mr. Hot and Cold. He's known for being super inconsistent, but can just have hot streaks out of nowhere. I'll let you put any points you want right now, Bryan, and then we'll discuss them sometime.
No, Russell Wilson's clearly one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. I think that goes without saying. But from a fantasy perspective, I've had him in fantasy before, and like you're saying, he's Mr. Hot and Cold. Like, there's games where he puts up 40 points, but the week after that, he puts up like 16, and then he goes back to 40, and then he goes back to 15, and it's like he puts up numbers at the end of the season, but he's like the Mike Evans of quarterbacks.
Yeah,
it's like you can't really trust him week over week to have a good week. However, the weeks that he does well, you're more than likely going to end up winning your game. I mean, from a fantasy perspective, you want a quarterback who consistently puts up 20, 25 plus a game. That's your ideal quarterback that you want to draft. And like Russell Wilson, I mean, he's a great winner, he's a great leader, but fantasy terms, he's a week on and week off. It's kind of tough to judge it.
Right, and I think it's more of the Seahawks' coaching staff to blame, just because they're so against the idea of throwing the ball in the NFL. To give you an idea of his hot and cold, though, last year from weeks 1 through 8, he was the quarterback 1, averaging 30.3 points per game. The second 8 games, he was the quarterback 11, averaging only 17.8. Like you said, it's one week he throws for 30. The next week he's only at 16 or 17. And that's really just because the Seahawks go, even though we won the game, we don't like how much we threw the ball. So we're just going to run the ball 3 times and then just punt it.
And, I mean, that's what the Seahawks are known for. They're known for, well, also, Russell Wilson's, most of his stats even come from just the second half of football. The first half of football, if you're worried that Russell Wilson has like 6 points, don't worry. He's going to get you 15 in the second half.
Right.
Probably. That's if they game script it right and make their comeback wins like they always do in every single game. But, I mean, that's just the definition of Russell Wilson right there.
It's just maybe with a more balanced offense, like you can be that hopeful, because the thing is, at the end of the year, Russell Wilson will have the numbers to be a top 10 quarterback like he has been every single year. But you're never going to be able to really trust him, even if it's a good matchup, because the game script could just be running the ball the entire time.
Definitely.
So my verdict is, I would love Russell on my team, but I can't trust Pete Carroll that I can't take Russell as my fantasy quarterback. I'm just going to enjoy being a fan and watching him do well and just hope that the game he goes off is not against me in fantasy.
That's a good point. I'm not a fan of the Seahawks, but I completely agree with everything you just said.
Okay. So moving on to the running backs, we've got Chris Carson and what could have been Rashad Penny, in my opinion. So last year, Chris Carson had a streak where he was injured and fantasy players are getting really upset with him. But he finished as running back 11 on the year, averaging 14.3 points, 681 rushing yards, 5 touchdowns, 37 receptions, 287 and 4. He had 7 games over 10 points, a high of 23.5, and 5 games under 10. A lot of them are around like the 9.8 range. I would say he had 2 real bust games of a 4.6 and 7.9. Because the running game will be more of a focus in 2021, maybe they go towards that style of offense that LA has had for a while. Chris Carson, I think, is going to be a very solid RB2. That is one of the last running backs you can trust in that mid-third round.
I agree with that. I think Chris Carson, his entire career, has never been noticed as an RB1. He's always been Chris RB2 Carson for his entire career. And it's not even like, I mean, I don't personally like drafting Seahawks running backs. I mean, I also don't like drafting Seahawks running backs solely because they just got DK Metcalf and then they have Tyler Lockett. They have 2 studs where they need to feed targets to them on and off. And Russell Wilson loves to throw it deep and do all these magical plays. But at the same time, they give Chris Carson carries, but he's that guy that's going to get you like 10 to 15 points. He's never going to be that guy that gets you like 25 to 30 points and like actually is like a deal breaker to win your game. So from an RB2 standpoint, yeah, he's reliable enough to be able to plug and play in your lineup, but don't think anything more that he's going to emerge into an RB1 because he probably won't.
Right, exactly. I think his best finish was when he had the backfield basically to himself in the entire year. This is when they had Rashad Penny. Rashad Penny went down early to injury. Chris Carson in 2017, I think, finished as the running back 9, but he typically falls between the running back 10 and running back 15 range. So you just have to know, if you're going to draft Carson, he's going to be an RB2. he's never going to win you the week, but most likely he'll never crush you and be the reason why you lost.
Yeah, he never will hurt you, but he's good enough to plug into your RB2 and be like, okay, he probably will get a touchdown, but don't rely on a lot of the yardage and a lot of the catches that come along with it.
Right. Now to move on to the two most interesting guys to talk about on this team, DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett at receiver. So DK Metcalf finished last year as a wide receiver 7, averaged 14.4 points per game, had a 23% target share of Russell Wilson's targets, finished with 83 receptions, 1,300 yards, which is a Seahawks record, and 10 touchdowns. And I don't know anyone else who's counting, but he has 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns more than another receiver that went in his same draft class that year. Actually went 32 picks before him. I think his name's N'Keal Harry. And in total, between the 2 years they've been in the NFL, DK Metcalf has had 1,789 yards and 13 touchdowns more. But I don't know what team N'Keal Harry plays for.
I don't either. I think he just requested a trade from his team, and he was probably the biggest bust in all of draft history in the last maybe 5 years.
Most likely.
So yeah, I mean, I've heard that teams were trying to get DK Metcalf back because we should draft him in the first place, but it is what it is. I mean, DK Metcalf's a great player. Tyler Lockett is also a great player, but I mean, going around to all of it, N'Keal Harry sucks and DK Metcalf's just way better. And he's clearly a fantasy stud. Everyone knows it. I mean, he's fast, he's tall, can catch, I guess competitive catches, I guess you would say, in the back of the end zone. Like, he's just everything you need in a receiver, and there's nothing you need to really worry about him.
So what may surprise you, Bryan, is that I'm not super high on DK Metcalf in fantasy. But before we get to that, we got to talk about Tyler Lockett too.
True.
So Tyler Lockett had 100 receptions last year, which is also another Seahawks record. So we had 2 record-breaking receivers, which just is so against Pete Carroll's DNA that I just know we're not going to see the same offense we did last year. He had over 1,000 yards, 10 touchdowns, 6 games over 10 points, including 2 monster games, which was 32 and 45. But then he also had 10 games under 10 points, mainly just because he's now the shadow of DK Metcalf, with this also change from a pass-heavy offense to run-focused. I still think I still think Tyler Lockett will be valuable in fantasy. He's now taking the brunt of the idea that the Seahawks are going to be more run-heavies because DK's in the 2nd round, Lockett's in the 6th round. He still has that connection with Russell Wilson. He's now a safety blanket versus a deep threat like he used to be. But both of these guys just had a tale of 2 seasons. When Russell Wilson was cooking, in the first 8 weeks, they were the wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 4. The second half of the season, they were the wide receiver 17 and wide receiver 26.
Mm-hmm. My thing is that Tyler Lockett, for where he's being drafted, is a better decision than it is for DK Metcalf in round 2, like you were saying. I completely agree with that because Tyler Lockett's upside is way higher than where DK Metcalf is being drafted because we know that he's probably going to end up progressing a little bit from where he was. And Tyler Lockett, what I love the stat about Tyler Lockett is he hasn't dropped a red zone target in his career, I think. It's the most insane stat ever. And he just, he catches touchdowns. He had a 50-something point game last season.
I think it was 45. I think it was
PPR. I think I played in a PPR league and he had 51.5 or something like that. It was absolutely ridiculous.
It was something like 15 catches on 15 targets for 200 yards and 3 touchdowns.
Yeah, that's a caliber player that you can play in your lineup. And it's he might get you 6 points, but Tyler Lockett any day of the week could also go for 200 yards, and you got to expect that from him.
It's hard. So it's where Tyler Lockett is in drafts, he's in that mid-6th round where you take him and he's I don't have to rely on him anymore as a wide receiver 1 or 2. He's now someone I can throw into my flex, and I can expect 5 points, which is going to be upsetting, or I can expect 20-plus points on any given week.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it just comes down to the draft stock. It's Tyler Lockett's probably the better decision to take. However, DK is still going to have a good season, just not where he's being drafted.
So it's the reality is DK is not going to have 1,300 yards again. He's going to be the type of player, he's going to get 2 or 3 long shots a game, which you're banking on. And he's also going to get minimum 3 red zone jump ball touchdowns. So he's going to be the type of receiver, if he's going to be a top-end fantasy guy, it's going to be because he's ending the season with 10-plus touchdowns, not because of the total yards he's getting on each catch.
I agree with that.
Now to round out this team, we got Gerald Everett at tight end. Finished as the tight end 24 in 2020, had an 11% target share in LA, only averaged 4.5 points per game, 41 receptions, 417 yards, and 1 touchdown. So the one thing I just want to note about Gerald Everett is he was the first draft pick of Sean McVay when Sean McVay got to LA. McVay has decided that he no longer needs this player. But on the good news is Shane Waldron was his tight ends coach, is now his OC, so Everett does know the offense the best going into the season.
I like Gerald Everett because he's not just a tight end. He's like more of like a receiving tight end. Like he's pretty fast. He's pretty elusive. My only problem is that the Seahawks never really use their tight ends as much as you probably wish they should, since they they have Russell Wilson. I mean, now they have DK Metcalf, who takes a lot of the target share there. So I wouldn't expect a lot from Gerald Everett, but you never know. He could be that guy you could plug and play week by week. Could catch a touchdown. It's kind of like you got to see how it pans over the season. Are they actually going to use Gerald Everett in the offense, or is he going to be like another, like Disley, who's like good, who was supposed to be good but never really panned out to be like very good,
Yeah. So getting into that idea, so it's like I always feel like we watch Seahawks games and you see Russell Wilson constantly throwing to his tight ends, but none of them are ever fantasy relevant. So I kind of like look back at this year. So Russell Wilson targets the tight end 16% of the time. If you combine all 3 of the tight ends that they used last year, they would have made for a tight end 7, which would have equated to what Mike Gesicki did. The thing is, one of those 3 tight ends is still there and has been practicing with Wilson during the offseason, and that is Will Disley. And Will Disley is a story of what could have been. His first 2 years, he was on pace for what Gronk was doing, what Jimmy Graham was doing, what Travis Kelce was doing. But the problem is he lost a year to an ACL injury. He lost another year to, I think, a very similar injury. And then year 3, he just was basically not in the team, like wasn't used at all. But in those 2 years, in 2018, 2019, in the 8 games he was playing, was healthy, he was averaging 11.7 points per game, so it's a what could have been story for Will Disley.
I had him as my tight end when he tore his ACL, and I literally was like, he's my guy. I'm going to roll with him the entire season. Went down with torn ACL, and I was like, now I'm screwed.
That was the season where it was like, first week was kind of mad, but then it was like second week 15, third week 18, third week 10, which is just amazing numbers for a tight end.
Yeah, I mean, like down the red zone, you could definitely expect for him to do well, but I mean, again, that was also
before
DK Metcalf, and now DK Metcalf's in the offense. It's like, what's actually going to happen? Because Russell Wilson still runs the ball in there. You got to think about Chris Carson. You got to think about Tyler Lockett not dropping balls in the red zone. Now you got to think about the new Megatron, DK Metcalf. So it's like, I wouldn't trust Gerald Everett. He's a good sleeper, but don't put any faith in him. I'm going with Adam Troutman as my sleeper over Gerald Everett if I had to take someone.
Right. So my verdict for Gerald Everett would be, you can draft him as like an early sweeper. Like maybe since he knows offense so well, he's relevant in week 1 and week 2. But besides that, he's most likely just going to be a streamer, as we've mentioned a few times.
Yeah.
Time to talk about the second place team in this division, Los Angeles Rams at 10-6, had their divisional loss to the Packers in playoffs. Quarterback Matthew Stafford, running back Darrell Henderson, rest in peace, Cam Akers season.
So sad.
Wide receivers, we got Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp, Deshaun Jackson, and then Van Jefferson, if you're feeling a deep league flyer name. Tight end, we got Tyler Higbee. They had the 11th ranked offense and 1st ranked defense in 2020. They had a 56-44 pass run split. They have the 10th hardest schedule coming up for 2021. So talking about their first guy, new to the team, Matthew Stafford from the Lions. Finished last season as a quarterback 15. Threw for just over 4,000 yards, 26 touchdowns, which is a low number for that amount of passing yardage, to 10 interceptions. But he was missing his top target all season in Kenny Golladay. But I know you're high in Matthew Stafford, as you've mentioned a few times, so I'll let you kind of just start off the Matthew Stafford discussion.
I love Matthew Stafford, first of all. I think Matthew Stafford's entire career was excellent. The only problem was that he was on the Detroit Lions, and the Detroit Lions never had a good defense. They lost a lot of games, so Matthew Stafford from a win category has never been good. I mean, from a playoff standpoint, doesn't really have a lot of experience in the playoffs. From a fantasy perspective, I mean, I think he was the fastest growing quarterback to throw like the most amount of yards as a quarterback, and he's still a good player too. Like, it's not that Matthew Stafford just falling off a cliff. Like, the Rams wouldn't have signed him if it wasn't for a reason. For me, in a fantasy perspective, I mean, if I don't draft one of the top 5 quarterbacks, I'm waiting for the Tannehill, Burrow, Matthew Stafford. And if I don't get Tannehill or Burrow, I'm 100% taking Matthew Stafford, and I'm very confident with it because, one, they have a great defense. If they turn the ball over a lot, what's going to happen? They're going to be right in the red zone. Easy touchdowns to Kupp. Could be easy touchdown to Woods, Higbee, whoever it may be. Without Cam Akers now, this is going to force Matthew Stafford to pass the ball a lot more, which makes them even more fantasy relevant in my perspective.
That is true. So it's like having a good defense is such like a fantasy, like kind of like
it's the turnovers. If they turn, I mean, it sucks from the point where they'll punt a lot if they're like not doing it. But the Rams get a lot of turnovers. They're the best defense in the NFL. So if they're on the 50-yard line, they get a pick. Now you're 30 yards away. Matthew Stafford could be throwing for 300 yards and 5 touchdowns if the defense has a big turnover game. It could be as easy as that.
So it's like, for me, it's like the double-edged sword is like the Rams having a good defense means Stafford would never be in a situation where he's forced to come from behind and just be throwing constantly all game that way. But as you mentioned, having the good defense gives him more possessions and better just yardage situations. So like it's kind of like how you mentally think about it, and then having good defense kind of affects like your viewpoint on Matthew Stafford. My thing is he hasn't been a top 10 quarterback since 2017, but I'm assuming like most of the NFL, I'm going to be higher on him this year, but I'm not super into picking Matthew Stafford. But if I don't get my late round quarterback that I want and Matthew Stafford is still there, I'm taking him because I just feel like after the Matthew Stafford door, there's just like you're not thrilled with what your quarterback is.
All I'm saying is if Jared Goff can excel in the Sean McVay offense, what can Matthew Stafford do? And I'm looking at what can Matthew Stafford do with his skill set. I'm cool with Matthew Stafford if he's my fantasy quarterback, just saying that. I will take him if I have the opportunity.
That is a good way of looking at it. So, I mean, last year he averaged 255 passing yards per game with the Lions. So that's a 10-point floor at like a passing level. So if he throws, let's say he throws 300 yards a game, throws in minimum 2 touchdowns, you're easily looking at a 20-point week on average for Matt Stafford.
Also, it's like, all right, Matthew Stafford is on the Lions. They are not the worst team in the NFL. The Jacksonville Jaguars are the worst team in the NFL. The Jets are the worst team in the NFL. Why, when Matthew Stafford leaves, is it that they're automatically the worst team in the NFL? Okay, Kenny Golladay did leave too, but Jared Goff's coming in. He was a good winner on the Rams for a while. They went to the playoffs. It's like, why is it? Because Matthew Stafford was the leader of that team, and now he's coming over to the Rams. That shows how much value he actually has. Again, I'm good with Matthew Stafford. I think he's going to be great. Don't take him because I'm going to probably end up taking him.
Keep that in mind in our draft, Bryan. So talking about their wide receivers, we've got Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp, and Deshaun Jackson, who's new. Little wash at this point. So Robert Woods, or Bobby Trees as we sometimes call him, was wide receiver 13 last year, averaged 12.5 points per game, had a 23% target share, 90 receptions, 936 yards, 6 touchdowns. Plus, they used him a little bit in the running game last year with 155 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. We also have Cooper Kupp, who was the wide receiver 27, also had about a 23% target share, averaged 10.9 points per game. Similar numbers, 92 receptions, 974 yards, 3 touchdowns. The real difference between these two is that this year Robert Woods got the touchdowns and Cooper Kupp didn't.
Mm-hmm. I mean, my take on it is Robert Woods is a beast. He proved himself that he is a beast. Sean McVay loves him. He designs plays specifically to get the ball to Robert Woods because he's a playmaker. However, from what I've seen in Matthew Stafford, and I know how he passes, he's a guy that gets the ball out of his hands quickly. And Cooper Kupp is that Wes Welker, Julian Edelman slot guy. And I'm thinking big things for Cooper Kupp in this season. Again, he's one of my bigger upside guys for where he's going in the draft. And if I had to feel confident drafting either Robert Woods or Cooper Kupp, I feel way more confident drafting Cooper Kupp because I feel like the relationship between him and Stafford just works out better in the play style that he has.
Yes, it's like the biggest thing about Matthew Stafford is he's never actually had 2 receivers in the top 24. He's always had that one guy that Calvin Johnson, Megatron, then it was Kenny Golladay, Golden Tate for a little bit, but it's always been one guy. He's never had 2 guys, but that you could also just blame that to the Lions offense and just being the Lions.
Exactly. My take for everything is that it was the Lions. We're throwing down the pass. He's on a good team with a good coach, good offensive system. He'll do just fine. I think that Cooper Kupp and Woods both have good seasons, but if I had to take one, I'm definitely taking Kupp this season.
Right. For me, it's like I'm happy with both receivers on my team. As you Kupp is going later in drafts, so I'd much rather want a Kupp in that late 5th round than versus taking Robert Woods at the end of the 4th. But if I'm in a situation when I'm in the 4th round and Robert Woods is the best receiver still within that group, I'll take Robert Woods anyway, just because.
Yeah, I'll take him. He's explosive. He's a good fantasy player.
He'll be there. I just think it's like very important to see what happens in the preseason to see who Matthew Stafford really picks as his number one guy.
I agree.
And then Deshaun Jackson, he's basically a ghost of his former self. He's gonna have like this weird role where like he's on the offense, you're gonna know his name. Every now and then he'll break off like an 80-yard bomb for a touchdown, but I don't think he's gonna have a super major role in the offense unless McVay proves us differently. At the very best, he might have like a similar role to what Brandon Cooks had when it was Cooks, Kupp, and Woods. But I don't see Deshaun Jackson being relevant enough to take away from either Woods or Kupp's production.
The one thing I know about Deshaun Jackson, though, if you want to play Deshaun Jackson out of any year or any week of the entire year, play him in week 1 because whatever reason it is, he catches a touchdown in week 1, it feels like every single time. So other than that, don't play him, drop him. He belongs in the waiver wire, but if you want to play him week 1, guarantee he catches a touchdown. Mark my words, we're going to come back to this podcast, going to catch one.
And we're gonna trade him to the Sockers in our league. You hearing that, Tiffany? So moving on to the running back room, we got Darrell Henderson and I don't know yet. So I'm going to take a quick moment of silence for Cam Akers.
And it's over.
Yep. So Darrell Henderson finished last year as the running back 36 in the committee backfield, had 624 attempts, 624 yards, 5 touchdowns, 16 receptions, 159 yards, and 1 touchdown. Did have 4 games over 10 points. 3 of those were over 18 when he was used as like the feature like workhorse back. But then he also had 10 games under 10 points, and 4 of those games were less than 1 point. The most work he got was 20 carries and 3 targets versus Buffalo, where he got 114 and 1 touchdown. I think like Darrell Henderson is going to be the running back who you're drafting because he's on the Rams, but I don't think they're going to give him the workload we wanted Cam Akers to have.
Hey, when I lost 3 of my running backs last season, I had Darrell Henderson as my RB2. He was good for a couple weeks, and then they're like, wait a second, Cam Akers is actually really good. And then they're also going to run Malcolm Brown in the red zone. They're like, Darrell Henderson, we're just going to throw you in the shade. Now Malcolm Brown's gone. Cam Akers is done for the season. It's like, Darrell Henderson wasn't that bad as an RB2 when he started. And considering there's no competition for what we know now, I think he's pretty safe as an RB2. Doesn't feel good about playing as an RB2, but I think he's a safer option to play now because there's no backfield committee.
So right now behind them we have Xavier Jones and just a fun fan name, Jake Funk.
I couldn't tell you.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, like, how much fun would it be to say,
Jake Funk.
We want the Funk.
We want the Funk. That could be a fancy team name right there.
Another thing that is, McVay has basically said he will not risk playing Darrell Henderson in the preseason because if he loses Darrell Henderson, that's a major problem with the way he likes to use his offense. So you can draft Henderson knowing that McVay wants him to be the main guy, but they can easily also sign someone to just be the potential goal line back or just another back that could just be annoying for fantasy managers going through the season.
Agreed.
Now let's talk about their tight end. Tyler Higbee finished 2020 as the tight end 18, had a 10% target share, averaging 7.1 points per game, 44 receptions for 521 yards and 5 touchdowns. If you know Tyler Higbee's name, it's because you played against him the week where he scored 3 touchdowns on 5 catches. And it was besides that,
I played him that week.
Yeah, that was a terrible week for a lot of people. He had 12 games under 8 points, a low of 1.1. Was kind of irrelevant last year for fantasy.
Yeah, but the upside with Tyler Higbee is I do like how Stafford already had TJ Hawkinson in his offense last year. TJ Hawkinson was clearly a beast. Everyone knew it. So I could see the same type of play style transforming to Tyler Higbee this season. I don't think he's going to be an amazing tight end, but I think he's good enough to play if you really are struggling on tight end.
So what's funny, like I kind of like looked at that because like we know that they had Gerald Everett and Tyler Higbee. So last year in the McVay system, the tight end sold for 22% of the targets with Goff. If you put those two together, they would have been the tight end 3. So Stafford targeted TJ Hawkinson last year 19% of the time, which he finished as the tight end 4, but that was with no Galladay. So I was trying to think, okay, so what if there's a situation where Stafford still had his top targets? So if you go back to the last tight end on the Lions, who was Eric Ebron, he basically averaged 85 targets this season for like a 15% target share. So a little bit of a bump, but nothing significant. So I don't know if it's with the offensive systems, but I don't think there's anything there suggesting Stafford picks his tight ends to throw to. I think Stafford is throwing the ball to who he sees as the most valuable target on his team.
Yeah, again, Adam Troutman's my guy over Tyler Higbee if I had a choice.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to keep saying it while we go through these terrible tight ends in this division.
So my verdict is I'd be intrigued if he's the only tight end in the room. And I mean, I would draft him at the right spot, but it depends who's there at receiver or like a depth piece for me. I'm not super high on Higbee, but he's not at that point where he's being overdrafted for the potential breakout.
Agreed.
So now to move on to the Arizona Cardinals, who could easily be the leader of a division in any other division with the team that they have right now. 8-8 last season, just missing playoffs. At quarterback, they've got Kyler Murray. Running backs are James Conner, Chase Edmonds. Wide receivers, DeAndre Hopkins, AJ Green, Christian Kirk. Tight end is Max Williams. 6th ranked offense last year and 13th ranked defense in 2020. 56-44 pass run split. They have the 14th hardest schedule going into 2021. This is a team that's so loaded with offensive talent at the quarterback and wide receiver position. It's just almost a gold mine for fantasy if you get one of those two important players.
I think Cardinals are like one of the top teams to own for fantasy players, and it wasn't like that in years past, but ever since Kyler Murray came into the picture, it's been a huge upgrade for the entire offense, and DeAndre Hopkins.
Exactly. So if you're wondering why I didn't mention Larry Fitzgerald, it's because he's technically a free agent right now. I think he's in the complimenting retirement stuff process, but he was irrelevant last year with Kyler Murray. If he does come back to the team,
Still irrelevant.
still irrelevant. He's just a name on the team that will go down in NFL Hall of Fame history. But at this point in his career, he's just a body in a uniform.
Agreed with that.
So to really just move on to Kyler Murray, finished last year as their quarterback 2. But from weeks 1 through 15, he was actually the quarterback 1. It was just that injury allowed Josh Allen to really leapfrog him. Finished the year with 3,971 passing yards, 26 touchdowns, and 12 interceptions. But the reason he was super fantasy relevant was because he did so much running. 819 rushing yards and 11 touchdowns, averaging 24.4 points per game. His kind of base was 248, so 250 passing yards, which equates to 10 points. And then had about 51 rushing yards per game, so that's an extra 5 points. So Kyler Murray's average floor is about 15 points per game. So you were happy with that even if he didn't throw more than one touchdown.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think you have a little bit of a different verdict than me, but I've been hearing a lot about how Kyler Murray's going to be the MVP of fantasy football this season. And honestly, I truly believe it too. I think that him and DeAndre Hopkins had a season together. They didn't really click that much towards the end of the season. They're doing a lot of double coverage on him. I mean, it doesn't really help that Christian Kirk was the number 2 at that time. Larry Fitzgerald was there. But now bringing in AJ Green, now bringing in James Conner, who might be slightly better than Kenyon Drake. I think that, honestly, Kyler Murray probably has a better season than he did last year. They could potentially win the division now that Cam Akers is out of the Rams offense. I mean, it's a loaded offense to begin with, but I'm thinking big things for Kyler Murray this year. I like him. If I draft him as a quarterback, I'm happy with it. But I know there's a lot of haters out there, too, who thinks he's not going to do the same rushing stats as he had last year.
So I'm not saying that he's not going to be great. Don't hear what I'm not saying.
He will indefinitely be a top 3 fantasy player this year, and just calling it now.
Okay. So for me, as you were alluding to, I'm not going to draft a quarterback in the first 4 rounds.
Yeah.
With his quote saying he doesn't want to rush as much, that it just makes me a little concerned because the majority of his production was through the ground. I'm thinking though, if he doesn't get hurt and you see his passing numbers improve, if he throws, the thing is he needs to throw an extra touchdown or touchdown and a half on average per game to get to that level if we're going to see a drop off in his running production. But that could also mean maybe he's not rushing for 800 yards a season. But that could also mean maybe he's rushing for around Russell Wilson where it drops to 500 yards, but maybe he's getting some more rushing touchdowns. Maybe it's just I think the offense will change to him not being like, Kyler, could you please rush it? Just being he's going to run if he sees it. And as he said, he wants it to be a luxury, not a component of the offense.
I agree, but I feel like that also usually says for his rushing stats are going to decrease year after year. It's like Cam Newton did this his rookie season, his sophomore season, and then they're like, oh, he's going to drop off. And then after that, he just ran for 14 touchdowns. And you're like, okay, clearly he's still going. So I think Kyler Murray probably has 1 to 2 years left where his rushing is going to stay up, and then he'll start to decrease back and be like, okay, we need to keep him healthy. You know, we can't let him get hurt and all this. But I think for this upcoming season, they're going Super Bowl or bust. Like, we're going all out trying to win this thing. They got AJ Green, they got James Conner, they got all the guys they need to have a good offense. I'm thinking that Kyler Murray. I mean, also looking at fantasy football, there's always a different MVP every single season. It's like Josh Allen, my guy last year. Everyone hated on me for drafting him. Drafted him all 3 of my leagues. Looks how it turned out. MVP of fantasy football.
Right.
Also making another prediction here. Kyler Murray, I think he's going to be the MVP of the season, but that's just my take on it.
I mean, he's definitely going to finish as a top-end quarterback. If he falls into the 5th round, I'd love taking him in the 5th round. I can't take him in the 4th, just knowing the receivers that are sitting there with the drop-off in receivers after that.
I would rather have the Mahomes, Josh Allen than, like, Kyler Murray. Maybe even Lamar Jackson, too. It's like they're all in the same tier. It's like if you want to go quarterback heavy and draft a guy up top, then do it. But it's better in your sake for this draft to draft a quarterback later rather than get one of these top guys.
Right. I can agree with that. So speaking of some guys we just mentioned, we've talked about a lot already, is Chase Edmonds and James Conner. So Chase Edmonds last year was running back 28, averaged 8.8 points per game, 448 yards and a touchdown. Did most of his damage through the air with 53 receptions for 402 and 4. He's more wide receiver back, 7 games over 10 points. Then you also have James Conner, running back 26, coming in from Pittsburgh, averaged 11.3 points per game, 721 yards, 6 touchdowns, adding in 35 receptions for 215. His story was with the Steelers. First off the season, he was good, averaging 16.4 points per game. And then once he got injured and the Steelers changed their offense, he was basically useless the second half of the season.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know what to take for either of them. It's like Connor probably will get more of the touchdowns. Chase Edmonds will be more the guy that's getting in the passing work. I mean, we saw what Chase Edmonds was. Yahoo thought he was an RB1 to start. Didn't really pan out as an RB1. Kenny Drake came right back in the offense. It was kind of that lead dog who got 20 carries, got the touchdowns. I think that's where James Conner is going to fit into the role. I don't love James Conner. However, it's like you kind of have to trust him in an offense just because they're surrounded by such good players.
Yeah. So my biggest thing for each of these guys is James Conner is a glass cannon. He can be really good when he's not hurt. His only real good season so far has been the 1 year where he replaced Le'Veon Bell as a rookie. Every single year he's gone downhill either because of injury or just because his production has fallen off. My big thing with Chase Edmonds is he's a receiving back who the team has never really just been given the workload to. They had David Johnson, and then they, instead of moving on from David Johnson and giving it all to Chase Edmonds, they went and got Kenyon Drake. When Kenyon Drake moved on, they went and got James. It's like the organization doesn't trust Edmonds to just be a full workhorse back. But as we've seen, Cliff Kingsbury wants a running back involved, as we saw many times he rushed Kenyon Drake up the middle last year for 2 yards.
Yeah, I mean, that happened a lot. And then we also need to put in the factor that Kyler Murray will steal 11 rushing touchdowns or more. So that also plays in the factor. Will James Conner even be fantasy relevant? I mean, well, he's the Kenyon Drake of last season, but just think of it as a little bit worse than what he was.
It's like if you get both these guys, the production from both of them and one player in the 5th, 6th round,
then yeah, that's a good decision.
Be amazing. But it's just, you don't know.
You don't know.
I don't want to. You could draft both, and once one gets hurt, you get all the production from one guy. But that's 2 picks like too early of rounds to me to want to just have 2 players for one position on a team.
Agreed.
But the more fun to talk about is their wide receiver room. We got DeAndre Hopkins, AJ Green, Christian Kirk. So really the main guy we got to talk about is Hopkins, who finished last year as the wide receiver 5, averaging 14.4 points per game, had a 28% target share, which is unbelievable, 115 receptions, 1,400 yards, 6 touchdowns, 9 games over 10 points, a high of 25.5, 7 games under 10, low of 5.5. But that just really correlated with Kyler Murray's injury and the way the offense have changed when Kyler Murray showed that he couldn't throw the deep ball anymore.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the only guy really, I think, relevant to this team is definitely DeAndre Hopkins. I mean, they definitely had the chemistry there at the beginning of the season. He didn't really catch as many touchdowns as people wish he was, but the targets, the catches, and the yards were all there. So if you increase his numbers a little bit more in a touchdown sake, who can't say that he's not the number one fantasy wide receiver in the entire league? So I think clearly DeAndre is the most trusted guy here. AJ, I mean, we have seen year after year, hated the Bengals, got hurt, hasn't had a really good season in 4 or 5 years. I mean, the talent's there, but it's like we don't know what to expect from him. Like Christian Kirk, same time, he's another guy that you can throw into your lineup last year when he was a wide receiver too, but now it's more so that he's a little bit irrelevant because AJ Green took in that wide receiver 2 spot.
Right, so it's like AJ Green, 104 targets, finished as the wide receiver 68. The way AJ Green came into fame over the past years, as we remember AJ Green was just being a deep threat guy who would moss someone, as people like to say, or just contested catches down the field. He can't do that anymore, so it's almost like, similarly like Larry Fitzgerald, he's a name that you remember from the glory days, but I don't think he's not elite anymore. He had 4 games over 10 points last year, high of 15.2, but he also had 4 games where he completely goosed, so...
Chris will take him, so it's okay.
Yeah, so it's almost as like he's past his prime. He might have a game here or there where he gets 60 yards and a touchdown just because the defense is triple coveraging DeAndre Hopkins. You might have faith streaming him. He'll mostly disappoint you that week. Christian Kirk is an afterthought because he's wide receiver 3. And Larry Fitz, currently free agent. Even if they did change his position to tight end, he only averaged 3.6 points a game last year. He's really just a safety blanket, and that's about it for his career at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, all the other guys, not amazing. However, you could pick him up, get lucky one week, but it's really just DeAndre Hopkins when it comes down to it.
Exactly. And to round out the Cardinals, we have tight end Max Williams. Tight end 66 last year, averaged 2.2 points per game. He had 8 catches for 102 yards and a touchdown. He was playing as the second tight end behind Dan Arnold. If you want to try to extrapolate Dan Arnold's numbers, Dan Arnold finished as a tight end 23, averaging 5 points a game. Kyler Murray threw the ball 8% of the time to the tight ends. It's really easy to say just completely ignore the Cardinals tight end this year.
I mean, I feel like that's how it was last year. All the targets went to DeAndre, some were to Kirk, and then they ran the ball out with, Kenyon Drake. A lot of targets went to Chase Edmonds. They barely ever use tight ends. I don't see why they would start using the tight ends this year. He's kind of irrelevant.
Yeah, it's just basically an extra body on the field to block.
Yeah, definitely.
Rounding out the NFC West, Bryan, we got the San Francisco 49ers, 6-10, missed playoffs. Quarterback is Jimmy Garoppolo, for now. Running back, we got Raheem Mostert, Trey Sermon, but then you also have Jeff Wilson Jr. and Wayne Gallman sitting there in the backfield. Their wide receiver room is Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, and Richie James. The main focal point of their team at tight end is George Kittle. So not a single skill position last year made it through 16 games, going down as the most injured team in NFL history.
They're also one of the most boring teams to watch. I don't know why. I just don't love watching the 49ers. When they're on Monday Night Football, I'm like, great.
It's just like...
The 49ers are on Monday Night Football. It's like the only reason I'm going to watch because George Kittle's playing. George Kittle's fun to watch. But other than that, it's like... There's some good name players in there. There's some good fantasy relevant players. But for whatever reason, is that there's such a boring team to watch, and I'm just not a fan of the 49ers.
It's like their fantasy situation is basically just a what could have been situation.
Yeah.
So they ranked 15th in offense last year, 6th in defense, 58-42 pass run split, 14th easiest schedule for 2021. So just to talk about the quarterback room, Jimmy Garoppolo always gets injured, finished 2020 as the quarterback 39. He wasn't just injured. There were games where he was benched because he was playing so poorly. So he had just over 1,000 passing yards last year to 7 touchdowns and 5 interceptions, averaging 11.6 points per game. Had a base of 182 yards, which was only 7.3. And that one year where you thought Jimmy G was maybe a good quarterback during the Super Bowl year, he was only quarterback 14, averaging 16 points per game.
So for about 150 yards in the Super Bowl. So Don't think too highly of Jimmy G. I mean, I love Jimmy G from the Patriots days. Thought he was going to be a great quarterback in New England. We traded him for pieces, which I'm kind of glad we did. However, I personally think that Trey Lance will end up taking a starting job by week 2, week 3, because he is talented. He is very good. They took him for a reason at number 3. I think they should have took Justin Fields instead, but Trey Lance is also a really good prospect, and I could definitely see them just benching Jimmy G when he sucks and just throw him in right away.
So it's like with Trey Lance, it's almost just like a situation where if you have that extra pick in your draft, you don't know who to take, you could throw him on your bench because he's such a young elite prospect who's a really good mobile quarterback. It's just a recipe for he doesn't have the NFL experience to sit there in the pocket and make all of his reads, where he can instantly just bail and then rush for 10 yards of play if he really wanted to.
Yeah, I know. I like Kyle Shanahan. I think Kyle Shanahan is one of the best coaches in the NFL, so I think that he's in a good place to start his career, and I don't think his career will go to waste. So if he does get the starting job, I'd expect good things from him, maybe from like a winning aspect. I just don't know if it's going to equate to fantasy relevance at first.
I think it'd be one of those situations where you see once Trey Lance gets a start, everyone's going to be watching that first game
to like see if I should pick him up at that point in time. And I'm sure he throws one touchdown, and that one guy in your league is going to be like, I'm picking him up right now.
Exactly. Which, if you're like late in the quarterback stream and you miss the boat on your Joe Burrow, Ryan Tannehill, Matthew Stafford, Trey Lance could be appealing to you if he does take over for Jimmy G early on. But the verdict is, don't draft Jimmy G and just sit and wait and watch Trey Lance.
Definitely.
So they talk about the most tantalizing position on their team is their running back room. And as you can see, as my slide you're probably looking at, it's covered in just information.
They just give me anxiety, that entire backfield.
So the starter at the moment, Raheem Mostert, running back 48 last year, averaged 11.5 points per game. Really good when healthy, but he's never healthy. He played in 8 games last season, 521 yards and 2 touchdowns. 16 receptions for 156 yards. Over 10 points in 3 of the games he played, a high of 23. But then also had a low ball area where he had 5 games under 10 points, a low of 4.8.
Isn't Mostert hurt too?
Currently dealing with an injury in training camp right now.
Okay, I was going to say, I thought he was hurt and he might miss some time in the beginning of the season.
So then we also have Jeff Wilson Jr., running back 30 last year, averaging 11.3 points per game. So he had monster games when you knew he was going to be the starter, but not everyone knew he was going to be the starter going into each game. 600 yards, 7 touchdowns, 13 receptions for 133 and 3. 5 games over 10 points. 4 of those games were over 20 points as well. He really had 2 monster games. If you had the cojones to play him in your championship in week 16, he gave you 183 yards and a touchdown plus a 20-yard catch, which was 26.9 points. And he also had this week versus some bum team in week 7 where he had 17 carries, 122 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Do you remember what team that was, Bryan?
That's a tough team. It's probably the Seattle Seahawks, but I can't think of it at the tip of my tongue.
31-point game versus New England, which no one saw coming. If it was one of those games where it's like, is it going to be McKinnon or is it going to be Wilson Jr.? And if you picked McKinnon, you were just upset the entire time.
Oh, who was our guy back in the day?
You mean the guy who's...
JaMychal Hasty?
JaMychal Hasty, our first podcast episode.
Oh my God, that guy. I can't with him.
He was playing the 49ers.
It was the Packers.
Yeah, it was the Packers who had one of the worst rushing defenses. And we both played on...
That was the most disappointing week I've probably ever had in fantasy football.
I barely won that game because one of my opponent's team got a little hurt. Which
I won that game too in my other league actually, but he put up a whopping like 1.8.
I think it was like 6 yards.
It was really bad. Let's just say that. And then they just ran. I think they ran Jeff Wilson the entire game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what they did this year in the draft, they're like, our entire team gets hurt, so we're going to take rookie running back Trey Sermon from Ohio State. Transferred from Oklahoma in his Ohio State season. He only played in 8 games, 870 yards, 4 touchdowns. But people have him listed as a potential breakout candidate for running back because he's in Sean McVay's system. And he's 2 in the depth chart, and Mostert's injured right now, so Trey Sermon could sneak into that RB run starting role earlier than later.
I'm hearing good things about Trey Sermon just from other people around the league, and if he does get the starting job and say Mostert goes down with his injury that he gets injured every season, you know, Jeff Wilson really isn't the guy they want to go to. They're going to give Trey Sermon the ball, and with how heavy of a run team they are, I would probably draft him later in drafts just to hope that he's going to do well. But for how large this backfield is, it's like, will he actually get the 20 carries that you wish he was? Probably not.
But you know what the worst part is? Trey Sermon also gets injured because he got injured at Ohio State.
It's true. I mean, that's why they have 4 running backs. I mean,
right.
Wayne Gallman was...
He's there.
He was my guy in my championship league and in my other league. He was I think he was my flex guy when he was with the Giants. Like, pretty good running back. It's crazy that they're putting him as an RB4 at this point, which is just absolutely just insane.
If you don't know who Wayne Gallman is, he's the guy who basically took over Saquon's role when Saquon got hurt last year and the year before. A guy no one ever wanted to believe in, but then would just get 20 points every week, and everyone's like, no way he does it again, and then he'd do it again.
He just scores touchdowns. He's a touchdown machine, but now clearly he's going to be irrelevant because he's behind 3 other pretty average running backs.
Right. So for the verdict really is for me, if you want part of the 49ers run game, you commit to drafting Mostert and Sermon because where they are in drafts, you can take both knowing that Mostert may eventually get hurt, but if it's a situation where Sermon's able to take over before it's week 1 and Sermon finds his way up into the 7th, 8th round, I may just take him knowing what Sean McVay can do with his running back.
Definitely.
Because last year, if you take Mostert, Wilson, McKinnon, you combine them all into one running back, they would have finished as the running back 1 with 337 points.
I agree with that.
So it's what could have been. It's so tantalizing to know how good the running back system is over there, but we just all know that they've never been able to stay healthy.
You keep saying Sean McVay, and I'm trying to... It's almost to make me...
Kyle Shanahan.
And I said it earlier, too, and I was like, you're saying so much. I was like, who is actually the guy? I know you're just messing it up because we did the Rams earlier, but I was like, who is the guy?
The offensive genius is all you need to know.
Literally. They're both 2 amazing head coaches, so that's all you need to know.
So looking at their wide receiver room, we got Deebo Samuel, who finished last year as a wide receiver 98, averaged 6.8 points per game, only played 7 games. We got Brandon Ayuk, wide receiver 33, averaged 10.4 points per game, only played in 12 games. And then Richie James, who is almost irrelevant, wide receiver 105, averaged 3.8 points per game, only played in 11 games. It's one of those situations where everyone's on the Brandon Ayuk train. He's highest on the board right now. 750 yards, 5 touchdowns last year, 8 games over 10 points. But I'm not super confident on any of these guys. How do you feel about them?
I've never felt good about any 49ers players. I don't draft 49ers players for a reason, solely because they're a run-heavy team. They have a big backfield committee. They love to run the ball. Now we have Jimmy Garoppolo, not a great passer. Even if Trey Lance comes in, we don't know who's going to be the stud between Samuel and Ayuk. And at the same time, Ayuk's got the higher upside, but I just don't feel good about any of them.
And is this Deebo Samuel has all the talent. He's even used in the backfield, so he gets that extra running start, but he's always injured.
It's every season. It's just absolutely insane.
I don't think going back to high school, he's never finished a full season because of injury.
Yeah, no. I mean, I don't trust any of these guys. People will draft Deebo and Brandon Ayuk and think they're the best thing in the world, but we'll get disappointed quickly when they realize that they're not putting up the numbers you wish they did. So
I think we got the same thing. Is we're not drafting them because they have an injury history. I also have questions at quarterback. I'm not huge on Jimmy G. I don't know what's going to happen if Trey Lance takes over. Ayuk is interesting if you're taking him as maybe your wide receiver 3.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Because we got to talk about the main wide receiver, the last guy on the list for today.
The only relevant 49er that we can actually care about.
George Kittle. Only playing in 8 games last year, finished as the tight end 19. In the games he played, averaged 12.6 points per game, 63 receptions, 634 yards, and 2 touchdowns. If you remember George Kittle last year, it's because he had his monster game versus the Eagles where he had 15 catches, 183 yards, and a touchdown. In 5 of the games he played, he was over 8 points, breaking that average threshold as a tight end 10. Monster game, 32 points. And he also had a 20-piece versus the Rams. He just lost most of his season to injury last year, like every other 49er.
Yeah, I mean, Kittle's easily the second best tight end in the NFL. My only concern is that who's going to be the quarterback. If it's Jimmy G, it's almost like I don't want to take him. I'd rather take someone like Darren Waller or a TJ Hawkinson because I don't know, one, about his injury history, which he's been injured quite a lot actually in the last 2 seasons. And I mean, it's the quarterback. If Trey Lance comes in, I have high upsides for George Kittle. Either way, he's going to put up the numbers when he plays, top tight end in the league no matter what. But it's I think I trust someone like Darren Waller over George Kittle just because I don't know about the quarterback in a fantasy scenario.
Right.
But you feel good about taking George Kittle no matter what.
It's George Kittle had a 24% target share. So as you mentioned, it's the quarterback situation is such a question mark. So he can put up the same numbers that Travis Kelce does. But my thing is, George Kittle, he always has to really make a contested catch. He always has to fight through a defender to get the ball. Where you have Travis Kelce, Darren Waller, they're just always open because they're either just so talented, but it's also just because the way their offense is schemed, they're just open versus Kittle, and the defense knows the ball is going right to him, and they're just all over him.
I didn't even notice your note, too, and I literally just said word for word what you were going to say, and I didn't even know. Great minds think alike,
right.
Because I would rather trust someone like Darren Waller because the QB inconsistency is just it's just not there.
Yeah. Right, because the thing is, like, as my verdict is, you can draft him at his ADP. I'd rather the QB consistency that Dan Waller has, because we know Derek Carr is going to throw the ball to Dan Waller 150 times.
Of course.
And it's also just the safe, like, Dan Waller is safer. He is talented. Maybe he's not as talented as, like, Kelsey and Kittle, but he is the number one on his team. Doesn't have to worry about getting injured. Doesn't have to worry about a quarterback change. And since they're almost, like, right next to each other in ADP, I'm taking the consistency of Waller.
You put George Kittle in the Chiefs' offense, he puts up the same numbers as Travis Kelce. That's the level of play that George Kittle can put up.
It is.
It's just the team is kind of lacking his fantasy output.
Exactly. So, to wrap up everything, keep up with the news. This is when players are going to be rising up and down draft boards. Mock draft. If you're playing multiple leagues, mock draft those different leagues, because depending on the setup, which I've been getting to realize is, if you're in a big like league, let's say you're in a 10, 12 team league, you want to look for those late end quarterbacks. You really want to stock up on running backs and wide receivers. If you play in a smaller league, like an 8-team league, that's when you want to take an early quarterback, an early tight end, because you need the difference at those positions, because there's so much more players that you can pick from that you can stock up your team with 5 running backs, but you can only play at 3 of them.
I completely agree with everything you just said.
So as always, keep up with the news, practice. The NFL season is coming. We're almost 4 weeks away.
Almost there.
Training camps are starting right now. I'm going to the Patriots one tomorrow to snag some photos, nice. And I can't wait for football.
I cannot wait either.
As always, Brian, cheers.
Cheers.